Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Hi, folks. I'm Zulak Cholos Pascal, and welcome back to an Integral Stage series devoted to themes of deeper sexuality, the complexities of interpersonal polarization, and the dynamics of evolutionary relationships in general. We've talked before with noted integrative relationship warlock Jason McClain, and now he's back to engage us with a consideration of the principles involved in relational co-regulation. Something that's always an important factor between human beings, but perhaps is especially significant in so-called integral metamodern or liminal developmental relationships because of the many differentiations that are made explicit in such change and depth-oriented perspectives. How do we intimately and socially support and complement and challenge and modulate each other and ourselves, given the disparity that so often presents between different types, different backgrounds, different developmental stages, differences in maturity and vision and subtlety and self-understanding and nuance? Here to help us explore this concept of co-regulation is a guy who's presumably now wearing pants and no longer thinks Peter Limberg and I are gay lovers. It's the one and only McClain. Hi, Jason.
You know, I haven't watched any episodes of the Integral Stage lately. Has it shifted radically?
Yeah, we're in a whole new phase.
And I thought we agreed to be, more professional. Wow.
Hey, that was pretty professional. Summed up the concepts, used my radio voice, welcomed the guest.
I know I still hold a vision for you and he to be gay lovers in the future. If that is what you desire, I support your choices.
I do kind of love that guy. So
maybe we'll get there. As long as you're not breaking any agreements with your girlfriend, then I mean, yes, negotiate it. Have a conversation with
Peter, I do have a girlfriend.
Peter might be quietly crying right now in his mug.
All right.
Jason, anyway,
do we really need more regulation?
I thought we were going to have a serious conversation. Is this what it's like?
What is co-regulation? When you think co-regulation, what are you thinking?
Are you giving me an opportunity to demonstrate it somehow?
Please, bring it on.
Yeah. So the idea. So first of all, I just want to say that, like, while the integral practice is to see where we agree with people first, and then to what degree, like, it's a good, like, if you want to, for those listening, if you want to embody being at an integral stage of development, and rather than just have it be an intellectual exercise, which I think is one of the major problems in the community, but you want to embody it, meaning that's where you're reacting from and the world through which you interpret it. It's important to take on that practice of, all right, where do I agree? Where are they right? And then to what degree, right? And the longer I'm in this business and the more I look at stuff, I'm like, wow, they just have that wrong. And so part of this inspiration was I kept seeing people in relating communities, teaching courses and talking about co-regulation, and I was like, yeah, at a certain stage of development that works, and it really doesn't at a certain stage of development. And again, I think everybody who listens to these understands stages, and like they understand the basic concepts. So let's talk about stages of dependency and then several other things. But co-regulation first is really just this idea that we are co-regulating our nervous systems when we're coupled or when we're in a relationship. Like you and I right now could be co-regulating our nervous systems, even though we're not in the same system, in the same proximity. Lovers talk about it a lot. There's also dysregulation where, and using my own model, my own language, like the patterns just don't mesh well. And so, people get triggered, or somebody gets triggered that somebody got triggered, and then you spiral out of control. And like one of the things I think when you communicate about, especially about ending a relationship, and this is in in the relationships evolved stuff that I'm working on, there's the relationship post-mortem. It's like, all right, and all of that indicates what happened here, how can I improve in the future, like sort of self-diagnosing, which is why I think people should take a long period of time after a breakup to really assess themselves, and also, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons to take some time to heal after a breakup, also to make sure you're mentally and emotionally fit to date, and there's all sorts of other reasons for that, but the best way to communicate after the end of a relationship, when somebody asks you what happened, is simply say, well, it just wasn't a fit, or we couldn't make it work together, without blaming or vilifying the partner, right? But that's really the case for me. It's like, was it good fit? And I love the metaphor of gears. And some people, you just go, wow, we just mesh so well. Our patterns mesh well, patterns being the gears of the relationship. And sometimes they don't mesh well. And for some people, they mesh well, but they just need a little lubricant, a little gear lube, little grease on it. For some people, it's never going to mesh well, and your pattern, like, you're just not a fit. And there's lots of reasons for that. But when I kept seeing, so dysregulation is probably, we could say that's conflict, where both parties are lack a center. This idea of co-regulation is, all right, this other person's triggered, but I'm calm in the face of that. They calm down. The problem I have seen, though, is normally this is a concept that's related to a child and a parent. Like, if the parent's calm and the child's crying, the parent will, the child will calm down. And I see all this stuff being projected on adult relationships. And so I think it's very tricky. There's a few things if we're going to consciously enter a relationship, there's a few things that I think are fairly tricky. One is, and this is something else I've seen in transformational communities in the last few years, well, I'm going to find a relationship that will heal me. While being in relationship can be very healing, and being loved or accepted in a way that you haven't been before, or maybe you're with a new lover, and the things that the man or woman you were with previously, they used to judge you for, this new person thinks they're fantastic. They're like, oh, I love that. And they're like, really? Or maybe you don't like a part of yourself, and they say that's it's funny. My last life partner, there was a way she formed her words with her tongue and her teeth. And I used to say, I just love the way you do that. It turns out, oddly, that it was the thing that she was the most self-conscious about. I had no idea. So it allowed her to have a little bit more self-acceptance. Like, oh gosh, he actually thinks that thing I do that I'm self-conscious about, he thinks it's cute. Like, I just thought it was adorable.
That's some of the normal healing that occurs in a decent relationship. But that's different than entering a relationship for the purpose of trying to get healed.
Correct. So the thing I want to reinforce is, I'm not saying you can't get healed through relationship. We all can get healed through relationship. I'm saying entering one for that purpose, really bad idea, for all sorts of reasons. And I've had people approach me and say, hey, I had a woman, we were never lovers, but she came to a few of my workshops. She was looking to share her flat in San Francisco. She said, hey, I'm looking to heal my relationship with the masculine. You seem like a great guy. I think that might, and I was like, okay. I mean, I'm looking for a place to live. And I didn't really think much of it at the time. This is, years and years ago. It was, 7 or 8 years ago. But it was like, I should have said, no, that's not appropriate. You should seek out a professional for that. Maybe seek a male therapist, like, so you can have a container where you're experiencing, male energy, but also you're not in the same quarters. Anyway, so the idea of co-regulation is great, but only at a certain level of development. And the other thing is, it is happening all the time. You're either co-regulating or you're dysregulating. Co-regulating could be, a synergistic experience or a calming experience. Here's the other danger of it. And this is why I want to get into the stages of dependency and things like that. But one of the things, I'll just tell you a quick story. There was this woman I knew, brilliant, just sublime in her aesthetics, like gorgeous, but also just really well put together, super down to earth, and really a genius in her own right. And she was in this very toxic off and on relationship for like a decade with somebody who led relationship courses. And I asked her, I was like, so what's going on with that? And she said, well, when I sit next to him, my nervous system just relaxes and opens. Like there was a co-regulation going on. And then, a week later, he would be verbally abusive, and, they'd have this horrible conflict. And it was a pattern over a decade. But because she couldn't regulate her own nervous system, which is really the thing here, like he was a calming presence for some reason, like her limbic system just relaxed. And I think that's a very it's something we need to be cautious about, becoming dependent on someone else for our own regulation. And if we haven't had nourishing relationships in the past, it's very seductive isn't quite the right word, but
there's a kind of a tension that I'm curious about, because on the one hand, it's like you want to set yourself up and set the relationship up in a way where there's some kind of mutual ongoing developmental co-regulation. So you're stabilizing each other in some way, but you don't want to do that in a way where you become dependent on that stabilization. And you want to make sure you're not using the relationship the way an addict would to avoid the experiences that occur to you when you stop having access to your regulations. But at the same time, you do want to not become dysregulated. So how do you balance that thing in a relationship between the part of ourselves that's trying to avoid the experience of the dysregulated state in order to avoid, say, being present to what is inside us, and the part of us that's legitimately trying to avoid being dysregulated, because that's the responsible thing to do, is try to get yourself regulated? Does that question make any sense?
I think it does. Could you repeat it for me so I make sure I understand?
Yeah. So I'm looking at like two slightly different relationships to the notion of regulation in a relationship.
Yeah.
Where on the one hand, we're like overlooking to be regulated in order to avoid the experiences that come up when we're not getting those things that regulate us. So we're rejecting ourselves the way an addict would, trying to avoid all the experiences that come up if you don't get the addiction met. But on the other hand, we are responsible for keeping ourselves from becoming dysregulated. And that's what we're supposed to be doing, is figuring out personal and interpersonal ways to prevent inner chaos and organize ourselves so that we're functional, satisfied, creative, operational beings.
Yeah.
So how is that tension held?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends. I mean, I think we need to have a baseline, first of all, if we are, and one of the things I do on like a second date is lay out a foundation for our relationship. What are our agreements? How are we going to relate to the relationship? What's important to each of us about the relationship? And for a lot of people, they don't think that's sexy. And it's what's hilarious is when I was doing when I was proposing to do a course called The Romantic and the Cynic, a client of mine, she asked me, she goes, "And you're the cynic, right?" I was like, "What? No, I'm the romantic. Like I'm the poetry guy. I'm the rose petals while she's in the bath, randomly guy. I'm the romantic." But I like to get all these conversations out of the way. First of all, to have a conscious relationship. A lot of people, I think, misunderstand what having a conscious relationship means. To me, it means entering it consciously, getting all these agreements in place. And I think a lot of people just mean being mindful, like while they're in the process of relating. I think it's really important to set up the frameworks in advance. So, while there's a bunch of agreements, well, when I say a bunch, there's like 5.5 or 6, but 2 of them are, subsets. And it's that we're both responsible for our own experience. And this is not uncommon. All the wisdom traditions say some version of this, especially in the East. NLP does it. Plotinus did it in the West, for God's sakes, 2,000 years ago. We experience reality through our interpretations. That's why we feel the way we feel, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things I've seen in communities to talk about co-regulation for adults is that people aren't being responsible for their own emotional experience. Now, that might mean, it doesn't necessarily mean, hey, it's your shit that you got triggered, go figure your shit out. That's not, the technical phrase for that, I think, is being, an asshole. It's called being an asshole. Lacking empathy. But there is a tension between being empathetic and also accepting blame for someone else's emotional stuff. And triggers are almost never about us. It's about something even about that relationship. It's about something that occurred previously, especially if it's disproportionate. So, it's pointing to something that needs to be resolved from our past. And there are processes and technologies to do that, and that's great. But often there's this, propensity to blame, and then you're, likely to get into a dysregulated situation. But if you both enter with the conscious agreement that whatever comes up, you'll use to clear out whatever's still to be healed, whatever trauma or whatever, thing from your past, then you can have a truly conscious relationship. And also, it's easier to help somebody it's easier to be engaged in a co-regulation if you have that agreement in advance. The person already has acknowledged while they're not triggered, right? Because you set these foundational agreements when you're not triggered. So, so you go, okay, great. We have this container. 3 months down the road, somebody gets triggered, or a year down the road, or 2 years down the road. We have these agreements in place. That makes it easier to be like, oh, they've agreed that if they get triggered, it's probably something from their past. I can more easily hold space for them because I know I'm not being blamed for their experience, which seems uncharacteristic and disproportionate like that. I think
It's interesting to make this distinction between 2 kinds of consciousness or mindfulness, right? The one that's in the arena of the engagement, and the one that's referencing the meta arena of how we enter into this, or how we viewed it in our non-triggered state. And I think you're right that a lot of people over rely on mindfulness as a tool within the specific engagement, rather than applying it also to how we set up the whole situation of the engagements.
Yeah, it's my major complaint with pretty much everybody who talks about conscious relationships. I'm like, so what are your, and they're like, well, we don't have agreements, I'm like, well, that's not conscious. It might be mindful. You might navigate conflict really well. You might have great access to your own, interiors, but it's not conscious. It's mindful.
I'm curious how triggers relate to overloads. Here's a thing that happened in my last relationship that it's like near the end of it, I found that I was gaining a better ability to acknowledge when I was being overloaded. When I was starting to say, like, I'm full, I can't do this right now. Each one of these things that are triggering me a little bit, I could happily go into any of them. But when they're all being thrown at me one after the other, I get to a point where I couldn't actually do any of them. So it's not that the triggers were the problem. I could handle each of the triggers, but altogether it amounted to too much stimulation for me to address any of the triggers. And I would have to be like, oh, I had to learn to draw a line there, to exit the stimulation situation until I resume my ability to be present with each of the triggers.
Could you give me an actual, so rather than the abstract, can you give me an actual example of specific thing? Or, it doesn't have to be you personally. You could,
yeah.
give me.
Yeah. Well, let's say somebody's triggered by getting domestically criticized. You're not doing this right. You're not doing this right. And goes into a whole bunch of their own childhood stuff and things like that. And that's a trigger situation. And they go, okay, I actually have the capacity to be present properly under the situation of this triggering. But then the person they're talking to is going, yeah, but what about this thing about how we've made relationship agreements? And what about this thing about how you don't listen properly? And what about this thing, right? And they start going down this list, and you're like, each of
Yeah.
these triggers could be a problem.
Well,
I actually think I can handle each of these triggers, but what I can't handle is way too many things. Like, is that the same thing as being triggered, being overloaded?
right. So there's a couple of things, and I want to unpack it a little bit. First of all,
Sure.
it's never a winning move to bring up what you agreed to in terms of communication when someone's triggered. So someone like that's just, and it's a very, I've certainly done it in the past. I'm sure it's a very masculine, like, hey, this is the structure we agreed to. How come you're not communicating this way? Doesn't, if you're involved with somebody who's more feminine on the spectrum, bad move, super bad move. Or just somebody who's sensitive in the moment. And often, under the triggers, a whole bunch of, I used to know somebody who would get triggered just when they felt too much intimacy. Like they felt too, exposed or too, it was, getting, and they would say it would be weird. And they would say, it's just too much intimacy. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So, that.
Yeah, I guess what I'm probing is the potential difference, because I'm imagining situations where somebody, like, let's say you don't have enough blood glucose, and let's say you're not hydrated properly, and your ability to process things is decreasing, and then you're overloaded. But is that the same as being triggered?
So I understood the question.
Okay.
And I also understand that I hadn't answered it yet. And I just like, there was a thing you hadn't asked that I wanted to address first.
Please.
Anytime people are under pressure, any organism under pressure, a dog huddling in the cold rain, or a human, like we contract under pressure. So if there's, and we've seen recently in our society, I think one of the reasons there's been an increase in mental illness or symptoms of mental illness is because a lot of people couldn't handle the pressures of pandemic, being alone, multiple things happening, supply chain issues, virus, like what's really going on here and all, and a bunch of, so if you're under a lot of pressure, and to bring it home, it could be like financial pressure, or you had a long day, or like you said, you're not, you're hungry, or you're not well hydrated, or you didn't sleep well enough last night. Hopefully the person has enough mindfulness to just simply say, I don't think I have enough facility right now to successfully have this conversation. And that, and overload, there's nothing better, in my opinion, than beginning to do some sort of whatever meditation technique. I prefer Vipassana, that focuses on your bodily sensations. And when I work with a client, sometimes they'll say they feel a certain way, and I'll say, where do you feel that? Like, how do you, like, because they give a word that's an extra, they don't say, I feel, if I feel like they're disembodied, I'll ask them, how do you know you're feeling that? Where in your body do you feel it? Describe the sensations to me. So people are just getting more and more in tune with their body. And so, that's a developmental path. So I think that's helpful. It's also a bad move in that kind of situation if somebody's in overload, which is different than triggered. Overload is just, to your point, to me, triggered means something triggered from the past. Now, it might be something, and so it appears disproportionate. Now, it could be that it's been the same thing with the same person, and either you said something or you didn't, but it's like, it's not that one thing. It's not that you put the toilet paper on the wrong way. It's that there were 30 other things that you kept not doing around the house, and they finally blew up over the one thing. Or it was a previous relationship, like somebody used to do a thing and, you felt violated. This person hasn't done that, but you're either projecting or you're overly cautious about it, or something from your childhood, or who knows, but it gets triggered. And the key is the disproportionateness of it. It's firing off, we call it a gestalt, like it's a whole collection of events that stacked up the same emotional response in your nervous system. and that hasn't been cleared out yet. If you enter a relationship with the idea that it's a good thing that triggers get revealed so you can clear them out, or sometimes you go, oh, I didn't know that was a boundary for me. Now I'm realizing that's a boundary for me. So this is all good news and the positive nature of it. With overload, I think self-care is really critical. And, and I want to make sure we get to there's something about delaying conversations that is tricky in relationship too, and I want to make sure we get to that next. But I think it's really important for self-care. I had a rule when I was married that every Sunday it was just silence in the house, just total silence. And usually around 4 p.m., I was like, all right, I'm human again. I love you. It's good. We don't need to let's go, do whatever we do. And so, putting structures in place to nourish yourself, take care of yourself, making those requests, getting those agreements in place, I think it's important. Any important conversation, I think you should be well rested, not so fed that you're drifting off, but it's like I'll never forget. I think Pete Sampras. Some tennis player. I don't watch tennis, but I think I watched 2 games in my life. But I watched somebody ask a tennis star, "What do you guys do with rain delays?" Because they'll have rain delays, and it's like 4 hours. And they go, how do you keep your energy up, but also don't, And so they talked about having to be really careful about how much food you consumed, because you might puke on a tennis court. It's very intense, short bursts all the time. It's like running sprints or something. And it's kind of like that. You want to be fed enough to have energy, but you don't want to have a heavy meal and then say, okay, now let's talk about it. The trick, though, in the pitfall I've seen a lot, and I think women complain about this a lot, is guys I don't want to talk about it right now, and then they just never talk about it. You can't do that. You can't step over an important situation, but you might view it differently tomorrow. There was a period where in one relationship where I was like, hey, let's talk once a week to clear whatever needs to be cleared, whatever came up during the week. And if there's nothing, if it's amazing, great. But we still have we still check in, there's no kids, there's no TV, there's no devices, there's no, hey, let's dial in and just how was this week for you? Do you have any requests for me? Is there anything you want to express? You haven't expressed? And just if there's a really intense relationship, you want to make sure you have those things built in. And that helps to co-regulate, but also the structure itself helps to co-regulate. It's all right, I got this thing that came up. I don't know if it's wise to talk about it right now, but we have an agreement about having this conversation every Friday at 3 p.m. or whatever you guys decide. But it needs to be honored. Somebody needs to hold the integrity of that meeting. And
you mentioned delayed conversation as a co-regulation strategy. Is that what you mean? Sort of having regular set aside times, or do you mean something
yes.
Thing comes up and you go, hey, I don't think we're in a position to talk about this right now. Let's talk about it tomorrow at 4:15.
Yeah, but I do really recommend having a, if you want to have a conscious relationship, I really recommend having a regular time. And I don't think once a month is enough. Well, it depends on the intensity of the relationship too. If it's a very passionate relationship, once a week might be a good idea. If you're just madly in love and things come up and there's a lot of intimacy, or you're living together, it might be different than if you're not. But to have a regular time set aside. Let's talk about this tomorrow without a specific time, which is a pitfall a lot of people fall into. And then they're like, well, I don't know if it's that important right now. It's I still want to know what was going on for you. And, I think it's important. So I think having the co-regulation piece can be knowing that there is a regular interval conversation that we'll have, or a container for that. And so we don't have to worry about, in my experience, and we've all done this. This is just human shit. There have been times where I'm like, all right, let's talk about this tomorrow. And then people are like, well, is it really worth it? I don't know. But tomorrow is sort of a ambiguous thing. And if both people are triggered, it's really great to have that, like, all right, we're going to talk about this. Now, if you have so many dysregulated and unresolved things in your relationship that have stacked over time, you might eventually need a third party. The idea is if you put these structures in place in the beginning, maybe you don't. Maybe you never need a third party because you have structures in place to maintenance your relationship. It's like, it's like ongoing maintenance or prevention. It's like going to get a health checkup or taking your car to get the oil changed or, whatever. Giving the kids, playtime. Like it's whatever metaphor.
So do you want to walk us through the stages of dependency as you conceive them?
Yes. Well, I'm not sure if it's how I conceive them. Or,
I see.
I don't think I'm inventing them. I think they exist. I think, but as, yeah, but
the stages as you accurately perceive them to exist.
Yes, thank you. So there are stages of dependency. First, there's, just being dependent. You need to be fed by your parents. You need your mother's milk. You need to, like, however, whatever metaphor is there. You can't feed yourself. You can't, manage your own, like you're not potty trained yet. Like there's dependency. And then you need love, support, food, all those things. You don't yet have a distinguished consciousness or ego development. You're in many ways, you're fused with your parents. So a lot of times when I talk about self-esteem and boundaries, I'm like, and people are like, well, what about kids? I'm like, okay, it's not what I mean. Usually I mean adults, and like once you have a certain level, then my work takes over, generally speaking. But so these stages of dependency. So the first there's dependent, and then there's counter-dependent. It's like you define yourself as everything that's not your parents. No matter how amazing your parents are, anything they say is not cool. Right? You're 12 or 13 or 10 or whatever it's happening nowadays. Maybe that's accelerating, maybe it's decelerating. I don't know. But there's dependency, and then there's counter-dependency. And then there's being truly independent, which is, hey, I want to be what I want to be, even though, darn it, that's also what my parents want me to be. So a great example is I realized I want to be a doctor. My parents also wanted me to be a doctor, but I want to be a doctor in spite of the fact that they want me to be a doctor. Like that's true independence. Like you're no longer defining yourself as not that. And then there's interdependency, which is a chosen dependency, which would be like co-regulation. And so, and by the way, I used ages, but it's definitely emotional development, not chronological or physical development. So I've seen plenty of people who are, counter-dependent and they're 35. Like they're just, and, maybe they call it being contrarian when really they're just still in a rebellious stage of not being told what to do. I think we saw a lot of that in the pandemic. Some of it was general concern for, liberty, and some of it was, I'm just not going to be told what to do, which is like what a 12-year-old, 13-year-old would, it's like, well, all right. And that was their only motivation for not complying with stuff. Anyway, shouldn't even have used the word comply there. I just lost everybody at that stage of emotional development.
If it's not just age that moves people through those phases, what is it that moves them through those phases?
Well, it's emotional development. I'm not sure, like age, like we use age because it's something we can all relate to, but this from pre-rational, rational, and trans-rational. Plenty of people who are 40 who are at a pre-rational stage of ego development. Anyway, and then there's interdependency, which is a chosen dependency, but only two humans who are already at independence and autonomous can then choose a co-creative interdependence. That's where co-regulation can work really well, because both people are, first of all, they have enough facility to self-regulate. And I think the only way you can truly have healthy co-regulation is that both individuals are capable of self-regulation first. So like if we want to map across co-regulation to dependency stages, to stages of dependency, you have to be at least independent and autonomous emotionally first, and then you can enter into a co-creative and interdependent relationship. Here's the tricky part. At any stage from counterdependent on, codependence can slip in. It's sort of a lateral move. It's a while. Nah. Let's see if I could draw on the ladder, but like stages, and also a thing over here. And no.
So codependence isn't a layer in that developmental stack.
Correct.
It's something that can happen at any one of those stages.
It's not like you could. Here's a great metaphor. Like your vertebra, like you could have a subluxation. That would be. It's one. It's one potential metaphor for. It's like it slips out in one direction. Like you, and I don't want to say slip a disc, but like one of your subluxations, if one of your vertebrae is a little bit out of alignment, and it could be in any direction, but it's a lateral move. It's not a stage, and it can happen at independence. It can happen at interdependence, and you have to. So if you're going to be truly conscious and mindful in your relationship, you have to be vigilant about codependence. And I define codependence because I think it's it's one of those things that's overused. Like narcissism is overused these days. Codependence used to be overused a lot. I define codependence as first of all, if you were reliant on the person to regulate your nervous system in the context we're talking about, that would be codependent. But also, if you're perceiving your value through how the other person views you, is my preferred way of defining codependence. So, and that has us do all sorts of weird things. I'll violate my own boundaries to keep their approval. And you could say that most relationships are highly likely to slip into codependence at some point. But it really is like I don't want to do this, or I really want to do this, but I don't do it because I'm afraid of them, their disapproval, or I do it because I'm afraid if I don't, I'll have their disapproval. That is codependence. And it's very tricky. It's really tricky to maintain that. But interdependence is often confused with that. In both directions, by the way. Some people are like, no, we're interdependent. Some people are like, we're totally codependent. But really, they just have a designed dependency that's working, but it's just sort of on autopilot in a positive sense.
What about the value, the positive potential of some forms of dysregulation? Like sometimes we need to be shaken up or transformed, and we're doing that in a way by deliberately sabotaging what seems like stable regulation, because we might pathologically or healthfully understand that what we need is to be broken out of some kind of homeostasis that we're in. Like, in what way might a person positively, in a healthy way, whether consciously or not consciously, be trying to get themselves into a dysregulated state? When could that be good?
Well, I mean, first of all, we want to assume that every behavior has a positive intention, even if it doesn't look like it on the surface. So if somebody's sabotaging a thing, it could be that really they're trying to end a unfulfilling relationship. And I believe everybody is worthy of a fulfilling relationship. Not that they don't necessarily deserve it, but they're worthy of it. They just need to accept that. But to me, there's also the real, and I really believe this. Anytime somebody's triggered, it provides an opportunity to heal something from the past. And so if you're intentionally dysregulating, it could be it's because you don't have the communication skills. It could be that there's some part of you, some wise but unconscious part of you that's sort of operating underneath, going, "Hey, you got to heal this thing." It could also be that they're looking to, like, and I've seen this. I don't like this frame, but I can't deny it's not a real thing. There's a, like, let me do this thing so that, and it's potentially dysregulating for the relationship. And if you accept me through that, then I can finally relax that maybe you do really love me. And we've seen people who either they don't love themselves enough, which is the most common thing, or they haven't been in really healthy relationships in the past. And so they can't accept people loving them. By the way, this is one of the most frustrating things for people in relationship is like somebody's madly in love with you and they just see your greatness, but you can't accept that. You're like, well, either you don't have as high of an opinion, and it's not that they're delusional. You're like, you just can't accept it. Like they're actually seeing you, but you haven't accepted yourself, or you've never experienced that love before, or you're just afraid of that and then losing it, or whatever. I had somebody one time tell me, I was like, why are these people afraid to be alone? And they're like, well, or there was a, how do I describe this? There was an organization, and if somebody was like off the grid for 3 hours, they'd freak out and be like, where are they? And I'm like, why are they like tripping out on everybody's location all the time? And this was a personal development organization. And this person, they said to me, well, most of them don't like themselves. And so like being alone is terrifying to all of them. And I was like, well, gosh. And so there's that aspect as well. Like they just don't love themselves enough to accept the love of other people. And so they might dysregulate intentionally for the purposes of like verifying the love. But also I wouldn't want to be in that kind of relationship. like a couple times, sure. And then I call it meta commenting, like popping out and be like, hey, are you trying to test how much I accept you? Like, just speak to the dynamic.
Right.
If they're conscious and mindful enough, they might be like, yeah. I'm like, okay, well, what do you need me to do to prove that I actually love and accept you? And that, that in and of itself can be transformative if you can speak to it lovingly. Again, if you were like, are you trying to, if you're an asshole while you're doing it, has the opposite effect. But if you're kind and loving, like, hey, so is there something you need me to do to, like, what do I need to, if you're kind and sweet in that moment, it can just dissolve it.
There's a kind of ideal here about kind, loving, conscious relating and entering into partnerships consciously and setting up the right kind of frame. Is there a point in the developmental stack, let's say, where that becomes viable? Because it seems like most of human history consists of people not doing that at all. That the vast majority of all relationships from the beginning of time have been unconscious. We fall in love. You mentioned wise but unconscious, right? Could it be that there's a long period of time and a large number of stages of development where our conscious just isn't equipped to handle it, where our subconscious is basically more capable than we are, and that shifts at some place in the developmental spectrum?
It does. Unfortunately, it's pretty far along the path. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is, give yourselves grace. Like, if you're not there, it's okay. There's only one place you can be, really. And this isn't just a cliche. It's really like, and I used to experience with clients sometimes. They're like, I thought I'd be further along. I'm like, by what standard? I mean, we all know that the self to other comparison is silly, but one of the things I like to point out is that we have another self to other comparison that's more insidious, and that's self to idealized self. It's like, well, like I made up. It's like, by what's in it? Like, you made it up, and then you're shaming yourself for not being further along. So wherever you are is fine. We're all on our own path. I mean, there's some people I don't want to be around, and there's such a thing as evolutionary fit, which I definitely want to make sure we get to. But you can't have too much of a gap in your development. But wherever you're at is fine. I'm assuming everybody listening to this has been on some developmental path, even if it's simply Zen meditation or but probably a few different developmental methodologies or modalities they've probably been engaged in. So yeah, there's definitely a point, but and there's also a point where, I mean, hey, I 3 or 4 years ago, like, I don't think like, I could count on one hand the number of times I've been triggered in a relationship, all my relationships in the past. Like, and then I had one that was deeply challenging. And our patterns didn't mesh well. And, I got to, like, and the benefit for me, of course, was that I went, oh, that's what people are talking about. Cause I'd certainly been madly in love before. I feel very blessed to have, had a lot of very intense romantic experiences, 4 or 5 of them that most people only ever write about or only ever dream about. I've been very blessed with extraordinary women in my life. But there was this one where I was like, wow, what is going on with me? Like, it's going into Reddit, like, I actually had few experiences where I didn't remember what I said. I was very sober, but I got so triggered that I couldn't remember, unfortunately, a lot of it was in writing. So I got to look at it and go, wow, I said that, like, really trippy stuff. So I got to clear a lot of that stuff out. And, it's one of the reasons I took even longer being single and celibate after that relationship. It's like 2 years, I think. But yeah, there's that. But if we have massively uneven development, and you just want somebody a good friend of mine and I, years ago, we used to call it evolutionary fit. And this is 20 years ago, we were having these conversations. Now, recently, there's somebody who you probably know his name, and please, it's like Ulrich, or what's his name? He did
integral, something like that.
Something like that. Integral relationships, and he has a matrix of all the stages of development, and then, like, he has a matrix of, like, where they fit and what you can expect, what the result will be for each person if they're outside of this range of being relatively close in terms of development. And it's a lovely graphic. Like, the matrix is amazing. I was like, oh, thank God somebody fleshed all this out, because I intuitively had, I intuitively knew it, also had experienced it. And you really want to, this is why I think, and it depends on what you're getting into a relationship for, but this is why I think that people with a massive age disparity, like a woman in her mid-20s and a guy in his 50s, I'm like, what are you doing? Like, that's not gonna, it's not just, I mean, I get that there's an exchange, and hey, we all get to have whatever relationship we want to have. And if it's a casual encounter and both people are clear about that, that's a different thing. But if you're going to be in a relationship, you should have somebody where you're, well, in my opinion, you should have, it should be relatively equal development.
Yeah, how big a gap is viable in terms of thinking about a reasonably stable, satisfying, co-regulating relationship? Can they be a stage apart, 3 stages apart? Do they have to be at the same so-called level? How big a gap are we thinking about?
I definitely don't think you can do 2 stages. I mean, in terms of integral theory, 2 stages, I don't think that would ever work. Or it might, and it would be transactional. But I don't think it would be a lifetime partnership, but that's just me spitballing. I don't know. Ulchik would be the guy. But gosh, I really want to pull up he's got a wonderful matrix, wonderful diagram. Like, I don't see 2 stages. Yeah. And by the way, I ask values questions on the, almost as a it's like, hey, what are you looking for in a relationship? What worked, what didn't work for you, but also what's important to you in life. And it's so that I can hear them talk about, and I don't, it's more conversational. I don't want them to feel like they're being interviewed, but I'm asking values-based questions so I can determine what general stage of development they're at in terms of moral development, like spiral dynamics. So I know it's at least a match. I mean, and if I ignore that because of a chemical attraction, the results are predictable. Like if somebody says that family loyalty, stability. Like if they're talking about blue values, yeah, it's not gonna work. Or even orange, if their entire every conversation is about money, then that's probably not gonna. It's not gonna. It's like, all right, well, there's more depth available there. Like blue, they're probably gonna want me to go to church with their parents. Orange, it's like, yeah, I don't determine somebody's value that way. So, like for me, it would be, and it narrows the field. The more, and this is a depth and span question too. The more developed you become, the less and less people can see to your depths or understand you, and the more and more you can see into theirs. But also the fewer and fewer, it's the depth and span thing of like there's just going to be less people at that level of development, and that's okay. When you meet somebody, it's more fulfilling. But if there's too large of a gap, it's just going to be frustrating for both, confusing for the person at the lower stage of development, and frustrating for the person at the higher stage of development. Or you get into this weird like mentor student role, which shouldn't, like, I don't like in some contexts, sure. But it gets tricky really quickly. Also, it can kill turn on. And so, for some people, it's like it just, there's somebody recently who suggested a book to me, and it's this book on spiritual partnerships with by, good Lord, can't see over there, Gary Zhu. I read one of his books when I was like 25. You want to make sure you're not suddenly entering into a co-coaching experience, because that can kill turn on. And it's like somebody who's a life coach coaching their lover. It's not sexy. I've only done it once in the past, and in that context, we set an appointment. We made sure we met outside of our house. We made sure we called each other by formal names, like Mr. and Ms. Like, and I agreed to it because they didn't trust anybody else to work on certain things. I 100% do not recommend it, and would have normally considered that unethical and something I wouldn't suggest doing. I'd also, was very experienced and was willing to do it under certain circumstances, with certain boundaries in place like that.
It seems like, obviously a person would need to be seemingly orange or above in order to even have the opportunity to enter into an agreement about, we're going to be evolving and working on ourselves together, that there's a progressive direction that's available to us.
Late stage orange.
Now, when it gets to people who are a little bit more sophisticated in terms of that development, when they're trying to think about how we set up a healthy, co-regulating developmental partnership, how do you adjudicate between, on the one hand, trying to be sort of peers, trying to be equals so that we're roughly at the same value stage and respect for each other, versus being able to alternate between treating the other person as the mentor, guru, or coach, right? Because it may be that part of that development is to go into modes where you say, all right, I'm going to let the other person really illuminate me for a while, but it's on the grounds that we don't get trapped in that form and that I'm really illuminating them some of the time. So one is kind of flat level and the other alternates hierarchies.
Yeah. Well, also, I think if we look at multiple lines of development, it can be useful. Like there are areas where I have almost no sophistication or development. And then there are areas where I have very hot, like really like almost weird, like it's like, there's not a lot of people I can have conversations with that I meet on the street about like that. And vice versa. Like she would have, like she's got areas of it. And so I think there's nothing wrong with having very complementary, like I had a left partner one time. She was like, she had like these incredible, like she actually went to diplomat training. She had been to, I forget what she also went to finishing school, for women. So there was this whole like diplomacy thing and social awareness that she had that I just didn't, or that I thought was stupid and worthless and, like not worth, looking at all that. And then there were other areas where I was very advanced and developed and understood that she didn't. And so but we had like, it was very complementary. Like my areas of development, she was really good in, and she could communicate to me in a way that very few people could, that I could receive it, and vice versa. Like I had areas of insight that she didn't see, but she was very open and receptive. So we had this wonderfully symbiotic relationship in that context. So I want to make sure that when we're talking about levels of development, it's either you can't have disparate but also very complementary developmental verticals. So just want to
Sure.
point that out. I also think, like, to your question, I think if people get caught up on like who's in control or who, like, there should be, I know this is a uniquely integral thing, but like hopefully they're comfortable enough, securing themselves enough to be comfortable with the flex and flow. And if it feels like it's starting to get out of balance, you just have a conversation about that and be like, hey, it feels out of balance, and okay, great. What do you need? And like, you just have a loving, like unattached, like, oh, great. Thank you for letting me know that. And, not a big deal.
One of the things that seems like the practice of healthy co-regulation requires is an ability to be centered in the face of the other person's upset. But how do we figure out when we're doing that, and when we're doing some kind of, hey, I'm the more evolved person and I'm going to just pull back and be the loving, tranquil witness. But what I'm doing in that mode is not actually entering myself into the engagement at all, maintaining this fantasy of I'm the undisturbed higher person. Where do we see that as a problem versus the importance of trying to be centered and not allowing the upset to, become viral?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I think anytime if we're thinking to ourselves, oh my gosh, I've certainly done this. Oh my gosh, I'm the more evolved person here. Look at this person. Then you're probably slipping into an ego trap that's going to lead to bad results. And they may not be able to articulate what they're experiencing when you're doing that, but they'll feel it. There was I've been focusing on this evolutionary gentleman material, and I was in this group, and some guy, like, he's just complaining about women and then wondering why he's not getting good results. I'm like, hey man. And he's like, I'm incredibly fit. I've got $250,000 in the bank. I got a nice car. Like I'm doing all, and he's doing all this, like he's studied approach and he's comfortable walking up to any woman now. And I'm like, yeah, but the way you're relating to it is a subject object thing. And they feel that, like, they may not be able to articulate it. They may not have the language for it, but there's a transmission that goes on. I had this wonderful lover for a few years, and she had a t-shirt that she'd wear once in a while that says the pussy knows. And I was like, they, like, women are, I hate to make sweeping generalizations like this, but women are far more sensitive and intuitive, and like they need to, sense if the baby's hungry. And like, there's just something wired with, the hormones that are running through them. Just like testosterone has a certain direction, so does estrogen, and and all the other. I'm not a biologist or an endocrinologist, but all the things that are operating in their body, they have. And a lot of guys, like, I feel very fortunate. I was trained as a martial artist from the age of 4 because I developed a wider, actual physical awareness than most people. So peripheral vision, and like I had all these things tested from a very young age and developed, and it is developmental. But if you're slipping into the ego trap of you're more evolved, you're at least going to lose your audience, whether they know how to describe it or not. But really, it really should just be, what do they need right now? What's best for the relationship, and to look beyond ourselves. If you're doing that ego thing, you're already separated, and you're not in a relationship. You're in subject object mode. And I don't think that's an effective way to deal with lovers at all. Now, you also want to be able to stay centered while you're in a circuit with them. And you have to be cautious about that. It depends on their relationship, what they need. Sometimes I'm cautious about touching lovers when they're upset, because I don't want them to anchor comfort to them being like, you want to be careful about those dynamics. Something I, teach in the NLP training that I'm no longer doing, but but you want to be cautious about those kinds of things. You don't want to reinforce, but you should be, loving all the time. It's just like I don't like I like to give them flowers all the time, but not on the days that are expected. Those kinds of things. You want to give them the love and attention they need, so they don't seek it through. Oh, that's the other thing. I've seen people like if they don't feel connected to you, and this is a very lower stage ego development thing, they'll start a fight for the purposes of getting you present and activated and connected. And so rather than point that out and disparage that, you want to take responsibility for the fact that they probably don't feel connected to you, and you need to put some more attention on making sure they feel nourished, so they're not creating some sort of conflict for the purpose of having it be engaged with nervous
There might be
systems.
some of that that's inevitable if there's too great a developmental disparity, right? So like if one person has seen more of themselves and more of people, then they can see a lot of what the other person is seeing and feeling. The other person might not be able to see very much of them. And so on the one hand, the person who's not being seen has a need that it's not being met. But on the other hand, that other person feels that they're not getting access to that person. And they might want to probe that the way a hysteric might throw things in there and see what you can find, even though you might not even be able to see it, even if it was right in front of you.
Yeah. And this is, to the developmental thing. I'm going to say this in a very crude way. Don't fuck below your pay grade. Right? Or, said another way, don't dishonor yourself by blending nervous systems with somebody who's significantly out of your developmental range. And I don't have a lot of sex when I'm outside of a relationship. I have none, pretty much. And by the way, I was very promiscuous in my 20s, ran through a bunch of experience. I've had all the experiences a guy could want. And, it's been, I think 8 months now since I've had sex. And I'm quite comfortable with that, because I'm only looking for deep, meaningful experiences. And, now I'm not saying all their experiences aren't great. Like I support people having all of their experiences, all their desires, even if they want to have that as a lifestyle. Awesome. I love that. Go for it. Like I will look smiling, and, I'll pour some wine for you guys, and you guys have a blast. But I'm not, for me, there's almost a self-respect component. Do you ever see the movie Heat? With Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. And the scene I'm going to talk about is actually with Al Pacino. When Al Pacino, he's just too busy, and he's tracking down these robbers, these high-end thieves and bank robbers. And his wife, who I don't know her name, but good Lord, that woman was smoking hot in that movie. And Al Pacino comes home, and they had separate, he slept somewhere else and they were in an argument. And some guy comes out of the bedroom, and she just says, "You should give me some more attention," or something like that. So I don't have to disrespect myself by fucking him again. And I was like, yeah, and the guy's sitting there he just going, "Oh my God, what did I walk into?" And I was like, right? Because she did. He was way below her pay grade. And also, Al Pacino's character, the detective, he was not he was never at home. He's working 18-hour days, sleeping at the office. And she's like, "All right, well, I need some attention, or I need to get railed," or whatever. And so I do think that's a real thing. That's a metaphor for everything you were just talking about, which, and also something else you were pointing to. Sometimes somebody will be like, "Oh, really? You can't get triggered? Well, let me test that." And, you could just meta comment on that as well. It's like, well, would you like me to get triggered? Or if somebody tries to run a guilt trip on me, I'd be like, do you want me to feel guilt right now? And usually they'll back off or deny it. But
that seems really essential, because when I'm thinking about co-regulation, I'm assuming there's a lot of creative work involved in figuring out your needs and communicating your needs back and forth. And a lot of people who've been on developmental trajectories have been involved in sort of struggling with things that seem to be their needs. They're constantly challenging themselves, trying to overcome themselves. So I've noticed they're very often hung up around the question of needs at all, like as if that's the thing they're trying to get beyond through maturational development. And it makes it hard for them to have those exchanges to co-regulate.
What is your name now?
Zulak Cholos. Right. I stubbed my toe the other day and I made this noise and I heard myself make it. And I like that noise. That's going to be my new name. It's like Zulak Cholos, I said.
Well, anyway, so your name, sir. You know what I realized? I don't like this. So I start off by saying I usually try to agree with people and then but really, like, I've been noticing where I disagree a lot. It's like, no, that's off. I don't like the concept of co-regulation at all. I think it is an absolute trap for codependence. It's like, hey, you see this cheese? Let's put it in this trap. It's called co-regulation. Would you like some of this? It just seems like a pitfall for codependence. And like, I don't, and in fact, so my first, one of my peers made a long post about co-regulation. I was like, sounds like institutionalized or co-regulation. I said, it sounds like institutionalized codependence. And he's like, well, people who are codependent can't possibly co-regulate. I was like, and
what's a better concept? What's a concept that makes the difference between codependence and whatever we're talking about clearer?
I don't even know, man. What I do know is co-regulation is a thing out there, and it can be, but so I don't like it because it's such an advanced concept that very few people are developed enough to use it in a clean way and without slipping into a codependent dynamic or even craving it. It's like it ends like in that situation. It could be that he or she doesn't feel like they're getting enough attention. It's already telling me they're slipped into some sort of codependence because they can't just request it. They can't be like, hey, I need some attention. Be like, oh, thank you. Like, I've been in my own mode. Thank you. And one of the agreements, I like, if you just like the power of requests, especially like, well, anybody, but if you need a thing, if you crave a thing, desire a thing from your lover, you can just request it. And if they say no, then, I mean, that's sort of weird, unless it's, but if it's like an emotional thing or it's like, hey, I need some attention. All right, great. Thank you. Like, thanks for letting me know. I'm happy to provide that. Like, it shouldn't be a thing. But so the reason I don't like it is because the propensity for it to be abused or misused. Like, I mean, if we look at the spiral, like, I know it's an upward spiral because it's a wider embrace of the world and all it is. But in terms of depth and span, it really narrows. Like, there's just fewer humans who can engage in healthy co-regulation than those who are likely going to misuse it because they're at lower or more shallow stages of development, depth versus, like, we could think of it as concentric circles as well, which usually resonates more with people at, green, in terms of spiral dynamics, green, stages of development. Like, we talk about depth instead of height. But yeah, it's just, it's so like the, if you enter into going, hey, we're going to co-regulate each other, it's just tricky. So, the idea is self-regulation. It can't happen unless you have massive facility with self already. That already takes a high level of development, being able to navigate your own interiors. There's a whole set of distinctions I created years ago called facility with self, which is basically like 4 or 5 points of how to navigate your interiors, what specifically means, what does facility with self mean? But if both people have facility with self, then there's the occasional thing that happens and one person just, could be perceptive enough and also be centered enough. But you have to be engaged and empathetic. And I think that's the difference, circling back to your question from 10 or 15 minutes ago, that I'm not sure I've answered yet. You have to maintain connection and empathy with them, not just externally, not just like, but also internally, but without feeling attached to making it better. And I think that's a lot of things that, especially guys, get caught up in, like, how do I fix this? Woman's upset. How do I fix this? And sometimes, she just needs to, or we all, it's not just women, but like, you just need to feel things for a minute. The more you try to fix it, the longer it's going to last. Probably it's an odd thing. And they'll self-regulate if you're just there and loving them. But you can't be disengaged, even if you're fully present. Like, you could have eye contact or touching their hand, but internally be like, you can't fucking believe I'm going through this bullshit right now. My God. Then she's going to feel that. I think, or he is going to feel that. They.
What about the role of the constantly evolving world of social matching apps? Because on the one hand, these things seem like they are a direct line to superficial, unsatisfying connections. They seem artificial and unnatural given the history of human interaction. But as a tool for opening people to the types of relationships that might be healthy and regulatory, given their skill set, given their self-facilities, given their developmental situation, it might be a really good tool going forward. But what would a person have to put into their profile, so to speak, in order to signal what they needed in order to get developmentally appropriate, healthy co-regulation, or whatever word you want to use?
Yeah, thank you. So I've done a bunch of, I'm not on any dating apps currently, but I have had 2 long-term relationships, one for 4 years, and we met on a dating app. So but I've also been looking at online dating since, I think matchmaker.com was one of the first ones, and it was 20 years ago. Horrible interface, like, just, so I have a very mixed opinion of it, but it really, like, your question zeroed it in. What do you have to put in your profile? And so for me, like, the major mistake people do is they just do visual matching. When I was on it, I never matched with a woman or sent an interest until I had read her profile. Like, just read the thing. Now, some of them are really smart and they'll put something at the end that's like, I just put this in here to see if you were reading. Also, it's a really smart, like, a lot of guys, and that guy I talked about, and I tried to give him some advice, and it didn't, it's like it went over, like, he's still in his blame and resentment. I mentioned 10 minutes or so ago, this guy that was complaining about women and how he was probably transmitting that in the dates. Like, he would get a lot of phone numbers, but they would never return his, like, they would text him, but they would never text back. He sent us some screenshots. I'm like, yeah, I see why. But part of it is I would mention something from their profile. Like, and it's not like you're beautiful or like if they didn't have any text, I don't match or respond, or if they reached out to me and they seemed interesting, I would say, hey, there's not much in your profile. What are you looking for on this app? That's always my opening question. What are you looking for on this app? Looking for a hookup? I'm not their guy. Like, just not. And so I think being open and honest about what you're looking for. Now, I have or had no hookups, like, in all caps at the bottom of my profile. And I had women who were like, no hookups, I'm not sure. And I'm like, yeah, as a general rule, I never have sex before the 3rd date period, no matter what. And they're like, oh, okay, well, and I had one person who, she was lovely, and we interacted, and I sent her a link to an article I wrote about truth over comfort and healthy foundations for relating. And she's like, yeah, I'm totally not up for this. That's amazing. She actually said, I don't feel like I'm emotionally mature enough to engage in this, but that's awesome. I was like, oh, cool. Thanks for saying that. That's, really courageous of you to say that. Like, so I think it's just about being direct about what you want, and making sure that your communication is designed around that. But the visual matching thing is important. I mean, and aesthetics are important for some of us. So I certainly wouldn't, like, Like, and I think a lot of people don't understand, like, there's apparently one app that does no picture at all. And it's because I'm like, yeah, well, I'm not doing that. Like, you want to see the person. But you don't want to base it on that. You want to base it on the connection. So just having like going at that consciously and mindfully as well. And I have a process. It's like, first we chit chat back and forth, but not for very long. And then say, hey, would you be willing to have a video call so we can get a deeper sense of each other, is the language I use. They say, yes, great. And you get on the call and you get to get a sense of them, and you talk for 30 minutes and then you set up a date. To me, that's a logical process. But, and in that call, like now, like it used to be on like a first or second date, I'd ask the values questions. Now I just do it on the video call. Like, do I even want to, go meet this person? But, a lot of people just don't like, there's a whole cottage industry, I think, giving guys advice on their dating profiles. Just horrible. Their pictures and the things they say. And the way I get so many messages unsolicited on Facebook from women who know me, like, and they're like, can you believe what this guy just did? And I'm like, no, I can't. like they're either overly desperate, they want to get into her, like, let me, hi, you're beautiful. She responds back, and then they have like a erotic fiction thing where they want to, and then, or God, what's your fantasy? And it's like, and they're all over 40, by the way. They just don't know how to actually, I should just plug this. I'm working with somebody right now. We're developing a digital product for men who are dating over 40, like divorced, and, like, hey man, here's some dating advice, because you are fucking it up. Sorry.
What about political polarization? It seems like one of the things people are finding lately is an absolute inability to cross between what seem like the two large political polarizations. Now, is that just a screen for people at different levels of development, or is there something like a left-right polarity that becomes a real issue in trying to establish healthy co-regulation?
So I find this topic fascinating. And so I don't know if you remember this. Remember the Raging Cajun? He was Bill Clinton.
The phrase.
So I don't remember his name, but he was.
Right. Yeah. He was Bill Clinton's advisor.
Right. I think he might have been his campaign manager or strategy consultant, or he was a dyed in the wool Democrat. His wife was a Republican strategist consultant. And somebody asked, so she'd be on Fox News and he'd be on MSNBC. And somebody asked one of them one time how they made it work. And I don't remember what their answer was, but I, in my head at the time, I was probably like, well, they know it's not real anyway. It's all, to them, it's just a game, and they're consultants, and they, who knows, maybe they have fun with it. I don't remember what they said. And maybe I'm doing them a disservice by suggesting that, but I wrote a post about meeting, and this is just a couple weeks ago. I met somebody. I'm in Seattle. I met somebody randomly. Like, I was eating dinner at the bar at Cheesecake Factory. Drop in, have a burger or whatever. And there's a couple women next to me. We start chatting. They're there from Eastern Washington. And they're in the Roe v. Wade thing had just been leaked. And the woman next to me she's 40 and a mother of 2 and married, very pro-life. And she didn't know what an ectopic pregnancy was. And for those who maybe don't know, it's where the fertilized egg starts to grow in your fallopian tube. There's no way for the mother to survive it. It could potentially kill her, in fact. And so, and the fetus cannot survive it. She didn't know what that was, but she was very pro-life. And we got to talking. And we also, one of the things we had a very long conversation that they were going to see a comedian. And we had like an hour-long conversation about all sorts of things. Nobody got triggered. They were as far right as you could possibly get. I was like, well, the issues are I haven't voted in 16 years, and don't care for either political party, but the Republican Party has tracked really, really, really far to the right in the last, like, I've been stunned as I've been paying attention again. But one of the things we talked about was this doesn't have to be a thing. Like, we're just talking about stuff. It doesn't have to. And one of her lines was, like, in the first 3 minutes, I said something about Trump, and she goes, and I might have said, like, I could see voting for him the first time because he was just an outsider, but people who vote for him the second time. And she goes, I voted for him the second time. And I was like, oh. And she goes, you probably hate me now. I'm like, no, but I'm deeply curious. And we just went on, an hour-long conversation about a bunch of things. And I was really curious, Now, would I want to be in a relationship with that person? No, probably not. But mostly it was because they were so misinformed about so many things. It wasn't because we disagreed politically. And so, but we had a very congenial conversation for an hour about a ton of things. I think that's something that's been lost in our culture. And part of it is because I think there's a marketing strategy among some people in the political parties to just trigger your limbic system. So if you look at political ads, or like, it's not intended to actually, and we're a country of 350 million people with a wide variety of religions, a wide variety of beliefs, a wide variety of experiences. And there's no limbic system solution. So I think one of the things that, and maybe it is just emotional maturity, but I think being able to have conversations about those things and just a general orientation of curiosity. Like, I was like, you voted for him a second. Well, tell me what was behind that, right? Like, I'm curious, what inspired you to vote that? And apparently Trump was the first person she ever voted for. She'd never been interested in the electoral process before, which I thought was even more
You
curious.
see those kinds of exchanges, which I think I agree they're not going on enough anymore, if they ever were,
Right.
As part of individuals figuring out how to have healthier, let's say, co-regulatory exchanges with each other, or as a subset of like larger social phenomenon, as if there were two fields of, say, left and right, or sometimes there's men and women in general. Do you think of those as real entities trying to establish healthier relationships with each other through the form of individuals having better relationships? Or is all that just subsumed into what it means for two individuals to connect?
I don't know. What I do know is the left-right thing. I mean, I prefer the verticality. Like, it's kind of a blue and orange to orange and green thing, not a left-right thing. And I'm going to say this thing that's probably just like, a bunch of people aren't going to like this. One of the problems of democratizing publishing tools like social media is that everybody has a voice, or any idiot has a voice. And the beauty of democratization of publishing tools like social media is that every idiot has a voice. Like, anybody can say things. It's the beauty and the problem of our modern society. So, discernment. And so I don't think until we can agree on what's real, like, all right, hey, that's and I don't know if there's a wonderful documentary called The Social Dilemma, and where it's just people who are, former executives of social media companies talking about how messed up it is, how easy it is to shift an election in a small country. Like, you can buy an election in a small country with just ads on Facebook. Because a lot of people don't know this, but in a lot of countries, Facebook is actually your portal to the internet. On, like, if you get a mobile phone in, say, Uganda, like, Facebook might be your portal to the world. Whereas, you and I would have to open a separate app for that. For some of them, it's just built in as their primary interface. You do an ad spend of $30 million and you can shift an election in that country. It's that kind of thing. Anyway, one of the things they talked about that I found fascinating was misinformation or fake news travels 6 times faster on Twitter than actual news. And usually it's because it's triggering, it triggers the limbic system and people spread it. It's misinformation. It feeds into their paranoia or whatever it does to those people who aren't discerning enough to be like, let me verify that. 6 times faster. I found that one the most, like, of all the things I saw on that, I was like, well, that's super interesting. And so, I think being able to know what's real in terms of left right individuals, I think it's really important that you're matched on values. Like, it is critical that you are matched on values. What's important to you in life? What's important to you in a relationship? And not just at the abstract level, because those will always be an abstract answer, but how would that show up for you? As a great example, if I say, if she says communication is really important to me, and I go, oh, great, me too. And then we stop there. Well, what does communication mean to you? How would that show up? And for me, it's, sharing your internal process or making requests. Maybe for them, and this is when I was married 20 years ago. I made this mistake. For her, it was when she got home, or I got home, I was supposed to ask her how her day was. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, as sort of a ritual. I'm like, all right, well, to me, that's not communication. That's like, just tell me how your day was, right? But for her, that was really important. For me, and we had a massive, which is why I was only married for 3 years. We had a massive, mismatch of values. And it was destined to fail, which is why I now ask those questions on a first date or before. But I think that's critical. Hopefully it doesn't show up as a partisan either way. I mean, I think reasonable, intelligent, discerning people probably shouldn't be partisan at all. Like, if you're consider yourself far right, or like, I mean, have you seen the political compass, the 4-quadrant thing? That's at least a little bit more informative, but I don't know. Am I answering your question? I feel like I'm.
Yeah, that was all right. A couple of other things you were sort of answering it. What do you see
you gave me a C+
that humans use in healthy co-regulation that might be applied to the human to internet relationship? Because one of the things, like when we're talking about being centered with someone else's upset, and there's emotional triggers and information comes really fast, and you're not always sure if it's factual or what kind of interpretive distortion you're getting, right? There might be similar. I wonder if you see commonalities in how people stand before this. For a lot of people, their device is the relationship they're having the most, and it's constantly throwing things at them. And how do we achieve some kind of decent co-regulation in the cyborg realm that seems like it's going to be a big part of everybody's experience going forward?
Yeah, great question. The one major one, and I'll go ahead and use a cliche here, is responding, not reacting. So you asked what the skill would be, or you didn't say this, but what the awareness would be. I'll say first, like, if you feel a shimmer of sensations that tells you you're triggered, maybe put the device down, maybe respond to it in an hour or tomorrow, or not at all. And just, ask yourself, first of all, am I triggered right now? And if you're triggered, it's like, there have been times where I've said, I don't think I'll be successful communicating effectively right now. Let's talk about this, in an hour or two, or on our predetermined, right? So I would still apply that same thing to online interactions. The other thing is to have a little bit more awareness around, like, I'm clear, like, and I've had to explain this to people a few times. I'll respond in a comment, and they're like, that's not what I was talking about. And I was like, I know. And there are 1,000 people watching. I'm actually speaking to them. Or they'll say, I knew that. And I'll say, I know you do. But there are 1,000 people who are lurking, and I'm actually fleshing this out for their benefit, not because I didn't think you knew. Like, like, I'm commenting not for the commenter, but for everybody else. So, and that's positively and negatively, like, in terms of being cautious about responding. No, there are 1,000 people quietly watching. So, like, I tore someone apart last night, and this morning they had left like a half dozen comments calling me evil and everything. I was like, all right, whatever. And mostly I suggested they read a few things, but I suggested books that are in their political domain. Like they were hyper conservative and they were blaming Biden for gas prices. I was like, hey, and they did it by saying, hey, gee, in 2020, gas prices were low. I'm like, yeah, simple supply and demand. Here, read this book by a conservative on economics. It was a pro-Trump meme and like that. So, and I was like, you know what? I don't care. And I unfriended them after. I didn't block them, but I unfriended them. This morning I woke up and they had, littered a bunch of my posts calling me an emasculated beta male and all sorts of other, things that she called me. I'm like, all right, that's fine. I don't care. So just know that anytime you're commenting, there's also like, I'm very cautious about my feel, again, to your question, just like there's certain people you're like, that seems toxic. I don't go on Twitter except to interact with certain, like there's some, and when I do, I'll be like, here's a thread and I'll have like 5 things. I don't engage. I notice the limbic system trigger of Twitter. Also, I think Twitter's a cesspool, but in general, but there are certain sports broadcasters I like to acknowledge or interact with, and so I go on there because that's their world, is they're on the Twitter world in terms of sports news, or especially NFL news. But just be aware of what it's doing to your body. And so just like you would draw boundaries around another human and how what they're doing feels, notice what interacting in certain groups or on certain social media platforms, notice what it's doing to your body. I think his name is Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. I think he wrote a book. He's written a couple of books and he's been speaking around, and he's one of my favorite thinkers right now, because he's basically like, look, here's the wisdom traditions. Here's what we're doing currently in our culture. And this is why we're setting up, I think the subtitle for the book is something called something like how we're setting up, how good intentions are setting up a generation to fail, or something like that. And one of the things he talks about in some of his talks is the radical, dramatic increase in self-harming among young girls who get Facebook and Instagram at a certain age. It's up by like 70% or something, self-harming, like cutting. And so, the more we can teach people to, like, it's not real. Like, social media is not real. I mean, you should be as real as possible on social media. I try to be. But just having that, again, it's a body awareness. So just notice when you're triggered or pull in, or if you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? Put the phone down. And my phone's always on do not disturb, and notifications are always turned off on my computer. I just manage my experience. So I then have choice to go in. Also, have you ever seen these people, they're on interviews and all these notifications are going off? Isn't that annoying? It's like, shing, dong, dang. I'm like, really? You're on national TV right now on an interview. You really need to hear that. Like, why don't you look at it later, when you're done being interviewed on national television? So but also, like, your devices are your responsibility. I've had people complain. They're like, oh my God, you texted me at midnight. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, don't you know I'm sleeping? I'm like, no, I don't. And your device is your responsibility. Or people say, how late can I text you? I'm like, you can text me 24 hours a day. I might not respond. It's like, my device is my responsibility. My device is for my convenience. So, text me whenever you want to text me. Gives people freedom. And also, we can't imagine, like, we don't know. There's no universal time. I know plenty of people who are up till 2 a.m. every night. So there's a responsibility, a locus of responsibility. And this is the only thing that makes co-regulation potentially healthy. I'm responsible for my emotions. Also, I might need your help sometime in terms of social media, and like, my devices, no, it's my responsibility. My triggers are my responsibility. And I might need some help sometime. One of the ways I help myself is by having notifications off on my phone. The only thing that is audible on my phone is the alarms I set.
I
That's it.
remember being in 13 or 14, and the phone rang, and my dad was sitting right next to it. I don't know if he was reading the paper or something. Anyway, he just sat there, didn't do anything about it. It was like a
Yeah.
revelation to me because I'd been assuming
Yeah.
you had to respond.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
do think generalized somatic self-awareness is a huge player in that. People who have that
Yes.
ability have a huge amount of freedom relative to these incoming signals.
Yes. And like you always are at choice. Now you have to be at a certain level of development to know that. And then you have to be in another level of development to embody that. But yeah, not just somatic awareness, but then also the well, yeah, it's all somatic awareness. And then but especially notice if you feel like like if you feel like you're not at choice, increase your awareness around the choice that you have.
We've been probing a couple areas here at what's probably the end of the discussion around extensions of the principles of healthy co-regulation. Left-right polarization, dealing with digital technology and the internet. Another area of extension that might be worth exploring a little bit is broader sorts of functional teams, right? Like, how do you decide who to have in your bunker, who to fight zombies with, who to reconstruct society with, or if you were just setting up some kind of generalized functional team with people, how do you think of that in terms of some of these same co-regulation principles that you use within a one-on-one intimate relationship?
Well, this one's tricky because if you're in a situation like that where you have to, let's say, just build a community off the grid, you're going to need a wide variety of skill sets. And so there has to be some latitude for like, dude knows how to pour a foundation, but also he doesn't want to talk about his emotions. It's like, okay, I mean, but he knows how to pour a foundation or build a still or purify water or whatever. So there has to be, I think a little bit more latitude for that. And this could feed back into the political conversation, like 350 million people, but there should be some allowance for, but also they need to be more complex conversations. So I think there's some, we have to provide more grace, and the more developed somebody is, the more grace they can give to a wider or be more accepting to a wider variety of people. Like, I think the whole trans thing, people getting triggered about the trans movement and scared, I get where that's coming from, like red, blue, terrifying to them. Me, I'm like, cool, tell me what you want to, I don't care. Like, I've been using they in my work for 15 years. Who cares what you want to be called? Let me know so I can respect you as a human, as an individual like that. Some people, I was talking to a buddy of mine from high school last night. He's like, yeah, thank God none of those people. And by that, he meant people who get triggered by people with different sexual expressions or gender expressions. He's like, yeah, my parents are like that. I know some people like that. Thankfully, none of them are my friends. We're like, yeah, be whoever you want to be. So I think there's that. But then there's if somebody is continually triggered all the time, though, they take a lot of bandwidth. And so, like, I wouldn't want to be in a bunker with somebody who they're freaked out or triggered all. Like, did you ever see the movie Platoon? Mm-hmm. Guy gets shot and he starts screaming, giving away their location. And I think it was Tom Berenger. He's like, shut the fuck up. Shut up and take the pain. Shut up and take the pain. And the guy did. He's like, right. And he'd been shot and he was, or he had, some like phosphorus on it. I don't remember what it was, but I remember that. And, you could say that's a more extreme form of co-regulation. But you don't want somebody who's, just spasmodic on the emotional. It's like, yeah, they're going to cause so much drag on the team that they better have some amazing skills. Otherwise, the overall benefit isn't going to be worth it. And I think that's a question everybody has to ask in every relationship, really, just to tie this off. It's like, hey, you know what? Is this fulfilling to both parties or all parties? In any, like, is there enough complementary, benefit? And I don't want it to sound transactional. Like, I hate the idea that, like, somebody told me a couple of years ago, he's like, well, all relationships are transactional. I'm like, Sure, at rational or orange, yeah. What benefit or value am I getting? Yeah, sure, that's one stage of development. But another stage of development, which it's not that that's untrue, but it's like, well, yeah, I just enjoy being around you. I think that's or or you're just not a drag on my experience. Like some people, like they're cool, and then sometimes you're like walking through a door jam, and it's almost like they're like the splinter that snags your sweater, and you're like, oh God, now I have to deal with this weird thing. So I think there's a calculus that goes on no matter what of like, all right, is this nourishing? Is it beneficial enough for me? And is it fulfilling? Is it fulfilling to both parties? And I think a lot of people, like we've talked about all sorts of other ways, but most people, I think a lot of people, there's lots of reasons they stay in unfulfilling contexts, whether it's a job, or whether it's a relationship, and usually it's security or fear about the future. But really, everybody is worthy of a fully fulfilling relationship in every context, professionally, personally, romantically, sexually. And so if you are not feeling fulfilled, you can request what you need, whether that's a pay raise or whether that's more attention from your lover. And if you don't get that, just go and find it somewhere else. Just leave and do it ethically and in honor, but like tell them. You don't need to tell them why necessarily. I think that's overrated sometimes, because then people want to talk you out of it or convince you otherwise, and then that starts to feel manipulative. But really, whether you're in a bunker or you're trying to find a new job, it's like you need to have a conversation with somebody, and sometimes you need to grab and say, shut the fuck up and take the pain. Not in a romantic relationship, but like, in a bunker. Or in the movie Platoon in Vietnam. Did that metaphor work? I think it did.
I think it was an example. I think probably some people can connect with the qualitative resonances of that example more than others.
It did rip like it's sort of, there were waves there, wasn't it?
Well, I think this was fantastic. I'd like to thank you and your ladder.
You said bunker. I mean, come on.
I know that was a natural extension of the bunker metaphor.
I think it was.
I'm to blame for the pre-framing.
No. I'm responsible for all my communication, regardless of its efficacy. That I might have lost some people. I might have woke some people up who were falling asleep. No, who knows? Or maybe some people will be like, oh my God, he's a psycho. I prefer to refer to his range of behavioral flexibility.
Yeah. A variation.
Range of behavioral flexibility. Say it with me.
How do I make this sound good at the end? You and your ladder have been very effective tour guides for exploring the swamp of what might be called healthy co-regulation.
Yeah. Is there any way I could? Is there anything else you need from me right now, or any other questions you have?
I think I'm good. Is there anything outstanding you still wanted to share?
No, thank you for always allowing me the opportunity to contribute to whatever random and varied listeners you have. Oh, and of course, evolutionarycompanies.com is my thing. But no, it's always a pleasure and always a joy to speak with you. Thank you so much, Mr. Zulak.
Zulak Cholos.
Zulak.